This year we're observing the 150th birth anniversary of Swami Abhedananda, a direct disciple and the third spiritual leader of this center. The Swami came to New York at the specific request of Swami Vivekananda in August 1897, and for the next 23 years, very successfully expounded on Vedanta and Hindu thought and culture throughout the United States until his return to India in 1921. In commemoration of this 150th anniversary, we're holding the Swami Abhedananda lecture series in religion and philosophy. This morning, we are honored to welcome as the fourth speaker in this series, Professor Edwin Bryant, Professor of Religions of India at Rutgers University. Professor Bryant received his PhD in the Indic languages and cultures from Columbia University and taught Hinduism at Harvard University for 3 years. He has published 8 books and authored a number of articles on Vedic history, yoga, and the Krishna tradition. His highly regarded translation of and commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali have been followed by his most recent work entitled Bhakti Yoga, Tales and Teachings from the Bhagavata Purana. In addition to his academic course load, Professor Bryant currently teaches workshops on the Yoga Sutras, Bhagavad Gita, and Hindu philosophy at yoga studios and teacher training courses throughout the country. At the end of his talk, he will open it up for a Q&A when you can ask questions.
So it's a great pleasure to be here in this very august place, a very special place, actually, in terms of the transplantation of Hinduism to America, perhaps the most venerable site, right? Is this not the first Vedanta center? So it has a whole history, and we see that a little bit reflected here, the way it's set up with the organ, and a little bit like a Protestant church. Because bearing in mind, 100 years ago, now Hinduism is cool, right? People have tattoos of Ganesh on their back, but 100 years ago, someone like Swamiji, who was really a communicator, he wasn't a Patanjalian yogi sitting in a cave Chittavritti Nirodha Ing. So his intention was to spread the teachings of Hinduism and give some dignity, actually, to Hinduism. And so we had to find ways of creating a space which as much as possible resonated with existing Western culture. So therefore the organ music, and I've been to the center in Boston, which is much more like a church, actually. You have pews. So to create a sense that, which of course the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, which is that that there is a truth that underpins all religions, and to kind of stress that a little bit by minimizing the cultural differences, even in terms of the space. So I hope you keep it that way, because it's really a reflection of a very important moment in historical time in terms of Hinduism's journey to the West. So I'm here to speak a little bit about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. That's what happens when you write a book. You get associated with that book and then you're invited to speak on the book. The Yoga Sutras is one of a number of sutra texts that emerge from the late Upanishadic period. So we have the Upanishads, which are the kind of oldest texts where we find the beginnings of philosophical discourse, the beginnings of spirituality. The earlier texts are more ritualistic texts, the earlier Mimamsa texts. But they're not systematized, they're not systematic texts. They're poetic expressions. You get a sense of practitioners in the forests engaging in practice, coming out of meditative states, and saying something, right? And trying to express their experiences. through metaphors. Different rishis are there, expressing different sorts of things. In some places, Brahman is depicted as a personal being. In other places in the Upanishads, an impersonal being. In some places, the Upanishads seem to suggest the world is an illusion. In other places, that it's real. In some places, Atman is somehow merges into Brahman, right? The Tattvamasi, the famous verses. Other places seem to suggest a distinction. And as a result of that, non-systematic nature of the Upanishads, in the late Upanishadic period, you get this sense that there is a need amongst Indian intellectuals to systematize the ancient teachings. Now, maybe because of the threat of Buddhism that's challenging certain long-held Vedanta views on the notion of the Atman. Maybe it's a sense of the Kali Yuga. If you read the beginning of the Puranas, many of the Puranas start off by saying it's the Kali Yuga, and the effects of this age are detrimental to the preservation of knowledge. Knowledge is getting lost, and or maybe falling into the wrong hands and can be misrepresented. So you get this sense to sort of preserve, fossilize, and systematize, which I think is reflected in the whole sutra genre of writing. So at this point, you get a number of sutra texts that are written. Vedanta Sutra, of course, the Vedanta Society is obviously anchored in the Vedanta Sutras. Same thing. Badarayana comes along. A sage called Badarayana comes along and tries to systematize these heterogeneous teachings of the Upanishads, tries to codify them, put them in a systematic format. Of course, does that work? The sutras are so cryptic, they're so incomprehensible that you can't actually read sutras. So then you have to read the commentaries on the sutras, and of course then you read the commentaries, and then pretty soon you have major divergences in the commentarial tradition, ongoing. So at the same time, you have, in the Upanishads, you have a few references to this thing called yoga. Not very many. There's a passage in the Shvetashvatara. There's a passage in the Katha. A few lines here and there referring to this thing called yoga. And so mostly the Upanishads are presenting descriptive. They're describing, they're saying there is this thing called Brahman and Atman, and that we are Atman, we are Brahman in some sort of way. But there's not that much of a discussion in the Upanishads about, okay, fine, so we're Atman, we're Brahman, well, what do we do about that? Right, let's say we accept that information. Well, what do we do? Just the fact that we know, okay, I'm Atman, fine, I'll sign off on that, I'll subscribe to that, now what? I'm not enlightened, right? So what's the next step? So in the Upanishads, you get these a few references to this thing called yoga, which is actually a practice by which one can attain that thing which is being described in the Upanishads, experience Atman and Brahman. But not just a few verses. The yogi is described as sitting, as living in a cave next to a body of water, and he has to create a seat not too high, not too low. Just a few references here and there. So just as Sage Badarayana, this intellectual yogi, we can say, we have no reason. The great intellectuals of ancient India were often serious practitioners. They weren't just intellectuals. So just as Badarayana writes the Vedanta Sutra to try to give some consistency to the disparate teachings of the Upanishads, another sage called Patanjali emerges at some point, and of course scholars try to date these personalities, and we don't need to get involved in that. There's always differences of opinion how you date someone like Patanjali. So someone called Patanjali comes along and he writes the Yoga Sutra. And establishes right in the beginning, Atta Yoga Anushasanam, that he is going to now continue, Shasanam, continue the teachings of yoga, which, as I say, are mentioned in the Upanishads, mentioned in the Mahabharata epic. If you read the Mahabharata, when the Pandavas are exiled to the forest, the 12 years in the forest, so scattered through the forest, you see these characters, these proto-yogis with the dreadlocks, right? And they're not obviously the protagonists of the story, but they're there. And they're always associated, the term yoga is always associated with intense austerity, tapas, with some form of dhyana, some form of concentrative exercise, and frequently powers. That with this intense control of the mind comes power. So the yogis are often scary, slightly scary characters. Especially, actually, if all of the great asuras of ancient India, how did they get their powers? Ravana and Hiranyakasipu. They did Ekapada Hastasana. They did these incredible yogic feats and concentrated their minds, and as a result of that, attained their siddhis, their powers. So that's actually probably why Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra, he has the third chapter on mystic powers, and then he says, but these are of no interest to real yogis. Well, why does he say that? Why spend a quarter of the text talking about mystic powers and then just say, well, they're of no interest? Well, because there were characters in ancient India that were doing something that looked very much like yoga from the outside, engaging in intense tapas, concentrating their minds, and they had no interest in the real goal of yoga, which we'll discuss in a minute. As a matter of fact, they weren't even benevolent, some of them. They were malevolent beings. They were asuras. So, therefore, as a matter of fact, Patanjali, in the 4th chapter, the first verse, he says these cities you can get them from samadhi, but then he says there's 4 other ways you can get them. You can get them from mantra, you can get them from aushadhi, some kind of plant, right? They're like that on the Lower East Side. It's the only verse they remember. So, Professor Brian, what's the aushadhi in chapter 4? And you can get it from tapas. You can get these cities from tapas. So these practices are there. We see them also in the Ramayana, also when Ram is in the forest. In the background, the yogis are there, here and there, scattered. So sort of common denominator of them all is ascetics, A-S-C, ascetics, performing intense forms of austerity, involving some kind of pranayama, some kind of breath control, and some kind of dharana, dhyana, or mind control. And some of the texts talk about 5 limbs of yoga, other texts talk about, Buddhists talk about 8 dharanas. So there's all these different schemas of yoga floating about in the pre-Patanjalian yogic world, which is mostly a forest-situated one. So along comes Patanjali, and for whatever reason, takes it upon himself to systematize all this, put it once and for all into a nice, clear, systematic format which would be preserved. Now, whether that's because of this idea that Kali Yuga is, as I mentioned, that Kali Yuga is sort of ravishing the old knowledge systems, also people's memories are declining. Writing is considered a sign of degeneracy. We think of it as a big sort of milestone in human civilization, right? Invention of, fire, the wheel, writing. These are big sort of signposts that we're progressing. But in ancient India, it was a sign of decline because you were supposed to memorize these things. So therefore, writing is a prop. It's a prop for a weak mind. I personally met in South India a Brahmana who knew the entire 100,000 verse Mahabharata by heart. And solidly. You could give him one line, not even the first line, third line, try to catch him out. Give him the third line, boom, he give you the whole verse. So this is not a myth. And not just in India, other Indo-European cultures as well. This sort of oral recitation. So whether it's because the sense that the memory is declining, Kali Yuga is making itself felt, and the knowledge systems need to be preserved, fossilized. Once you put it in a sutra, that's it. You may have all different commentaries for centuries and still producing commentaries. We have a new one, Swami Narayan has 10 years ago, now we have the Swami Narayan commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. These are ongoing traditions, and new, not just a rendition of the old commentary. The Swami Narayan tradition is a new commentary based on the Siddhanta, on the philosophical viewpoint of Swami Narayan. So it's not just a recycling of old commentaries, which mine is. It's just a recycling of old commentaries. So these are ongoing additions. These are living traditions. Vedanta is a living tradition. So is yoga. You could say that as well. I mean, after all, Guruji Iyengar has a commentary on the Yoga Sutras, which is, introducing many things that you don't find in the traditional commentaries. So you could either say, well, that's not legitimate. It's not, part of the tradition. Or you could say this is a sign that the tradition is living and adapting and engaging with its environment, which it always has. There's always differences between commentaries. Think of the difference between Shankara's commentary and Madhva's. So, for whatever reason, whether it's the sense that Kali Yuga is, that is the age, the detrimental effects of Kali Yuga requires that the Brahmins can no longer assume that memory, the knowledge is going to be preserved by memory, number one, and number two, tamas. That there's more tamas in the Kali Yuga, so maybe there's more a risk of knowledge systems being abused. Whatever the reason, okay, and we get some sense of that if you read the opening verses of some of the Puranas, the sense of the sort of fear of the Kali Yuga. Or whether it's the threat of Buddhism that's coming along and saying, well, there's no Atman, there is no Svarupa Avasthanam, which Patanjali is going to define the goal of yoga as being, that the seer abides in its own nature. Buddhism is going to say, well, there is no own nature, no Svarupa. Everything is interdependent. Everything is momentary. Nothing lasts for more than. So these are serious challenges to the Vedantic point of view. So for whatever reason, scholars would say around the 3rd century we won't have to occupy us. We'll leave dating to the scholars. We don't have to. We're more interested in the content of the sutras rather than academic scholarship. Typically, is more interested in context and historicity. So that's what really one of the main differences between an academic study of a tradition and a practitioner study. Is the practitioner typically, well, we can't generalize too much, is more interested in content, and academia is more interested in the context. What were the formative influences? What is the political milieu? What is the, what are the agendas, right? Postmodernism. What are the agendas of people writing this? Are the Brahmins trying to control everybody? What's going on? So, in a place like this, assuming we're more interested in content. So someone called Patanjali. We know nothing about him. Much later on, we have a verse composed about him that surfaces in the commentary of a king, King Bhoja, king, I think, Malwa. I can't remember the date, maybe 11th century or 9th century, can't remember. Who composed the verse that is recited now in Iyengar studios, right? Yogena Chitasya, Padena Vacham, Malam Sharirasya Chavaidikena, Yu Apakarot, Tam Pravaram Muninam, Patanjalim, Pranjalir, Anatosme. So that Patanjali gets associated with 3 things. He gets associated Yogena Chitasya for the mind yoga, Yogena Chitasya Padena Vacham with grammar, and it is a fact that there is a grammar written on the famous great Panini grammar, greatest grammar of all time ever, and this amazing over 4,000 verse grammar by Panini. Or someone called Patanjali writes a commentary on that. Now, is it the same? Is it the same Patanjali? Obviously, that's the kind of thing that scholars are going to quibble about. We don't need to concern ourselves with that. The verse also said he brought something for Ayurveda. We don't have any text that's surfaced under the name of Patanjali. Not that it could be something there, sitting in some temple basement. The text says 3 things. so we have this centuries later. We have this verse. I don't think Bhojaraj composes it. I think he's quoting it. So it pre-existed, Bhojaraj. So we have this. So in terms of the historical Patanjali, we know very little. Is the point. And then in that verse, the second verse, associates Patanjali with Vishnu in the form of Shesha. Abahu Purusha Akaram Shanka Chakrasi Dharinam Sahasra Shirsha Shvetam. So so by that time then, it seems that Patanjali has been associated with Shesha. Shesha is the Vishnu reclines when he creates the universes. He's reclining on Shesha. So other than that, we know nothing about Patanjali. So again, we'll leave that to the historians. And he writes this very short little text. It's tiny. It's 198 sutras. Average length of a sutra is 6 words. So if you put that all together, it's like 2 pages of 12, double space, 12 font, right? If you had an assignment at Rutgers, 2 pages, 12 font, that's a freebie, right? So it's a tiny, tiny little text, but extraordinarily profound. And of course, when you create a sutra, the idea is to make it minimalistic, as succinct as possible, because you have to memorize them. So before you memorize any sutra, you have to know Sanskrit. And to know Sanskrit, you have to know Panini. To know Panini, that's over 4,000 sutras. That's before you get out of bed in the morning. If you're a little Brahmin boy in the Gurukula, right? Before you do anything, you have to know Sanskrit. That's 4,000 sutras. So, but when it comes to Patanjali's class, that's a breeze. 200, 198. So they have to be, the definition of a sutra is, well, literally we know it means to thread. A sutra is a thread, but the characteristic of a sutra is minimalism. And so you have that witty saying that a sutrakara takes greater pleasure if you save one phoneme, one syllable, than the birth of a child. So that's how strict, that's the standard. So that's why Sutrakaras were never married. Nobody wanted to marry them. Wrong attitude for family life. So very, very minimalistic. Now the price of that is that you cannot understand a sutra. Vedanta Sutra worst of all. I mean, you have Vedanta. I think in the whole of Patanjali there's only 2 verbs in 198 sutras. Vedanta Sutra is even worse. You have sutras like, and then this. And then what? What? Where? How? So the Vedanta Sutra is even worse than, but Patanjali, there's a few sutras you can understand. It's not like the Gita. You can read the Gita. I mean, pretty much anyone, even knowing nothing about Hinduism, you can read the Gita and 70% of it, perhaps, you can get a good sense of what's going on. Not with the sutra. So there are even words even within the sutras. There's a word like vitarka that's used completely differently in 2 different chapters. So therefore, you're dependent on the commentaries. You cannot read a sutra by itself. You would never, to this day, if you see a translation of the Yuga Sutra with no commentary, pay attention. You'll see there's a bunch of words injected into it that are not in the original. If you translate a sutra literally, there's no way you can construe meaning for most of them. You have to read them with the commentary. And traditionally, they were always read. And so sometime shortly after Patanjali, someone that tradition says is called Sage Vyas writes the Bhasha, first commentary. Now, of course, Vyas is famous. It's probably very unlikely it's the same Vyas. We don't have to worry about that. And so where Patanjali has 6 words, Vyas will write 12 lines. And he'll tell us what the sutra means. You would never in traditional India study, to this day, study the sutras without the Vyas. And then after that, over the centuries, you have other commentaries that build on Vyas. Nobody messes with Vyas. Nobody disagrees with Vyas. Vyas becomes canonical. He becomes an extension As a matter of fact, there's even a position that Patanjali is Vyas, writing his own commentary. I'm not sure I'm convinced by that, but the point is there, that they're so closely connected. You can't separate the two. You can't read the sutras without Vyas. And Vyas' commentaries and canonical, and after Vyas, then other sutra writers write their commentaries. And what's the right word? I don't know about refreshing, but what's... one thing about the Yoga Sutra commentarial tradition is that the commentaries all sort of agree with each other. There's no major disagreements, at least on the basic metaphysics. There's Prusha, there's Prakriti. Yoga is Chittavritti Nirodha, stilling the mind. There's no basic disagreements. Later commentaries will add stuff, maybe Vedanticize it a little bit, but not to the point of changing the metaphysics. So therefore, you can talk about a tradition, a tradition, a yoga tradition. You can't do that with Vedanta. You can't talk about a. In fact, people use the Vedanta much too loosely, and they tend to use it just for Advaita Vedanta. But in Vedanta, you have multiple traditions, and they disagree on the most fundamental of issues, not just trivial little things. The fundamental, what is more fundamental than, is the world real, is it false? Is God personal, is God impersonal? Is the Atman one with Brahman, or is it individualized eternally? There are no more fundamental questions imaginable, philosophically. And Vedanta disagree on those issues. So we cannot talk about a Vedanta tradition if we have any knowledge of Vedanta. We have to talk about Advaita Vedanta, a Vishisht Advaita Vedanta, and so forth. Beda. But we don't have that, if you want to call it a problem, we don't have that challenge. That's a nice word. We don't have that challenge with yoga because the commentaries build on previous commentaries. So we can talk about a yoga tradition that is handed down, seems to disappear at a certain point. It's no longer a really living tradition. It's fossilized as a text. When the British go to India, they cannot find any living yoga sutra teachers. There are plenty of Nyayikas, there's plenty of Vedantins, obviously. They can find Vedic schools. They can maybe, I think there are one or two Sankhya people still around, but no living tradition. I mean, there's Brahmins who can read the text with you, but they're not part of a living tradition. They're just Sanskritists who can tell you what it means. So when the British came, it was no longer a living tradition. It had its heyday probably around the 15th century. Then it seems to have, for whatever reason, morphed into Vedanta or whatever, Purana. The Puranas really take over yoga, and the Ishvara Pranidhana element becomes highly developed in the Puranas. And even Dayananda Saraswat, the great Arya Samaj founder, he couldn't find a teacher. So it wasn't just the British. It wasn't just the people who didn't want to teach the British. Malechas, I'm not going to teach the Malechas. But even Dayananda couldn't find a teacher. And then, due to the quirks of Hindu nationalism and Hindu resurgence, and there's a fabulous book on this by Mark Singleton and various others. And so, now yoga is so widespread, it's attracted a lot of academic attention. Then it gets plucked out of obscurity almost by Krishnamacharya, and to some extent the great Shivananda or Rishikesh. And of course by Vivekananda, who writes Raja Yoga, and because in Krishnamacharya, for whatever reasons, in Krishnamacharya's case, of course, a massive focus on asana, on posture, and so that needs some kind of a justification. You can't just invent stuff. If you're a traditional Brahmin, you can't just make stuff up. You have to connect it with the old traditions. You have to find something in the Vedas or the Upanishad, the Smriti or the Sutri, or the Shruti or the Smriti. You have to find something. So for whatever reason, the Yoga Sutras then, because it has 3 verses on asana, gets plucked out of a period of decline. And then as asana comes to the West, the practice, postural yoga comes to the West, along comes the Yoga Sutras as the canonical text. So now, in the West, the 2 canonical texts for, I'm not talking about Hindu diaspora, talking about non-Hindus, Westerners who are, whether they know it or not, they're practicing, they're sort of adopting forms of what I suppose we call Hinduism. The two texts that have become canonical for the yoga community is the Yoga Sutras. People are reading, if you do a teacher training course now, you do 200 hours or whatever it is, you have to do 20 hours of sutra study. So it's now become, there's more people, I always joke, there's more people reading the Yoga Sutras in the West than in India. People don't read the Yoga Sutras in India. Who reads the Yoga Sutras in India? Nobody. You have to go, maybe you go to Varanasi, you find some Pandit in the Sanskrit department, he'll read it with you, but So due to the quirks of time and karma and who knows what else, here we are in the West, and the Yoga Sutra, now you go to any Barnes and Nobles, any bookstore, and you'll find multiple copies of the Yoga Sutra. It's now become a canonical text of world spirituality for whatever reasons. We don't need to worry about that because it's a fabulous text. And also the Gita. The Gita, of course, with its emphasis on dharma and action, was of more interest to Hindu nationalists. And the great figureheads of Gandhiji and Tilak and so forth, and Swamiji as well. So the Gita then also becomes appropriated. It also was actually not like the Yoga Sutras, which became obscured, but even the Gita was a scholastic text. It was studied by the Vedanta tradition. It was at some point it's taken out of the Mahabharata, who knows when, but certainly by Shankara's time, it's been taken out of the Mahabharata, and it's one of the Prasthana Traya of Vedanta. Vedanta Sutra, Upanishads, and the Gita are now become canonical for Vedanta, but Vedanta is an elite activity in pre-modern times. You have to be a male Brahmana to study Vedanta. So even the Gita was kind of an elite text until it became popularized and so forth in the sort of national, in the 19th century and 20th century, and then exported to the West, and then. So these texts have their histories, and of course scholars are interested in that. But as practitioners, we're less interested in how things came to be where they are, because religion and spirituality is never static. It's always flowing. It's always cross-fertilizing. There's no pristine Vedic anything. You read the Rig Veda, it's got nothing to do with modern-day Hinduism. Rig Veda hymns to Indra and Agni. So things are always, religion is always flowing and adjusting and according to time and place. So here we are in the West, in New York City, 21st century, and our two canonical texts that are most visible in terms of what represents Hinduism in the West, two Westerners, the two texts that have come to define, it's not the Bhagavata Purana, it's not the Vishnu Purana or the Shiva Purana or the Agamas or the Tantrikas. Of course, there's communities, right? Muktananda brought Siddha Yoga. I mean, there's expressions of it, but that's not on a popular level. On a popular level, the texts that have come to represent Hinduism to Westerners, to non-Hindus, are the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras. So if you want to be a sort of educated citizen of the world, then you have at least read the Gita at least. And if you're a practitioner of yoga, which of course this thing people call yoga, and with any degree of sophistication, at least you'll have a copy of the Yoga Sutras on your bookshelf. Well, you have to dust it off and show it to people, but it's there. It's there. So these are the two texts, and so I've been invited to speak to you on the Yoga Sutras, but time is up. Well, this is all Chitta Vritti. I gave you all my Chitta Vritti. We didn't get to the Svarupa Vasthanam. So Patanjali then kicks off Atta Yoga Anushasanam, that he's going to Anushasanam, continue the teachings. He's not claiming to invent anything. Anu means to continue doing something. So Atta Yoga Atta, now. Okay, and then you have these whole discussions. What does now mean? Right? What does it mean? Just like Tato Brahma Jignasu. What does now mean? Does it mean now we have the human form? Now we can practice yoga? Because we have now this capability of seeking spirituality, which animals don't have. So does atta mean now, in that sort of way, that we shouldn't waste a human form of life? with just behaving like animals, in the sense of just seeking sensual indulgences and shelter and food and progeny? Well, animals do that. So does utter mean now we're the humans, we're different only in that way? Otherwise, how are we different? Humans can seek truth, they can seek higher truth. Otherwise, dvipade pashu, the texts say, we're two-legged animals then, if we don't seek truth, either through science or philosophy or theology or in some sort of way. So does utter mean that, or does utter mean, and here you read the commentators, and the commentators can say anything they want, provided it doesn't interfere with the Siddhanta of that school. So you can interpret words and add meaning and contribute meanings, provided what your contribution does not conflict with the Siddhanta, it's called in Sanskrit, which means the philosophical conditions of that school. So in Advaita Vedanta, there's a Siddhanta, right? The world is false, ultimately Atman and Brahman are one. And provided but you can add any sort of exegesis or any kind of explanation you want, as long as it stays within the metaphysical parameters of your lineage. So utter can also mean, okay, now we've finished studying. Now what? Okay, so you read the Upanishads. Okay, so you know there's an Atman. Now what? You're not enlightened just because you knew it. So then maybe now are you ready for practice? Are you ready to do something about realizing that Atman? So utter, one word, can take you, if you study with a traditional Pandit in India, you better leave your watch behind at home. Don't be looking at your watch and saying, but Swamiji, we've been an hour, it's just one word. So utter can also mean, have you finished with the books now? You've got all the jnana you need? You want to keep jnana vrittying? You want to keep buddhi vrittying? You want to just keep reading more and more and more and more and more? And then what? You're going to die, then what? Then what are you going to do in the ante kale, the moment of death? Just keep thinking about, oh, hang on, Vishishtadvaita, no, and you're dying. What's the point of that? So utter can also mean now you've done all of that, put your money on a horse. Whatever your horse is going to be. Whatever makes more sense to your samskaras. You think Advaita Vedanta makes more sense or Vishishtadvaita. Who's making that decision? It's not the Atman. It's the samskaras in your mind that, who knows, come from past life practices, come from whatever, grace, Ishvara, Daiva. You can frame it any way you want. But your samskaras are going to resonate with, okay, Advaita Vedanta. Or somebody else is going to say, no, hang on, Maya. What are you going to do with Maya? And they're going to resonate with Vishishtadvaita. So whatever it is, put your money on a horse, and okay, utter. Now you've done that. Yoganushasana. Now maybe are you ready to engage in yoga? So for Patanjali, that yoga, and yoga is defined very differently in the Gita, by the way. Very differently. Patanjali's definition is yogas chitta vritti nirodha. The yoga is the nirodha, the stilling, which means jnana and everything, the complete and utter stilling of all chitta vrittis, all chitta, the mind, vrittis, all expressions of thought, all permutations of thought. Completely stilled, no more study, no more. At that point, when you're doing the meditation, all of that, that's your groundwork. You should have done that, like your asana, you should have done that. You do your asana, so now you're ready, you're sitting, right? You've done your jnana, done your study. Now, okay, you have whatever your siddhanta is, and now you're going to fix your mind. And that's what yoga is. Yoga is chittavritti nirodha. It's stilling, it's a radical proposition. Completely and utterly stilling the mind. Tada, then what happens? Tada, kim bhavati? Tada, then what happens? Drashtu svarupe avasthanam. Then, literally, there is the situatedness of the seer, of consciousness, svarupa, in its svarupe, in its own nature. Verse number 4, vritti sarupyam itaratra. Otherwise, vritti sarupyam is absorbed in the mind. So yoga then, so right there you have the whole metaphysics of yoga. First of all, it's dualistic. There is consciousness and there's everything else. There's prakriti, there's the mind, which is prakriti. Okay? And consciousness then has two options. Either it can be Svarupa Vastanam, situated in its own nature, or it is absorbed in other, the world, but through the mind. Vritti sarupyam. It's absorbed in the mind, and then through the mind and through the senses, it's absorbed externally. And Patanjali's Yoga Sutra then, and then Patanjali's yoga for Patanjali then is to attain a state whereby consciousness can be absorbed in its own nature rather than absorbed in anything else. Now, why a yogi would want to have that experience is discussed in chapter 2. Because when consciousness is externalized and flows through the body-mind and attempts to seek happiness in the world of sense objects through the desires of the imprints of the mind, it suffers. So ultimately, the ultimate goal of yoga is to transcend suffering. The Gita even defines it that way. Gita has 3 different definitions of yoga, and one is just to transcend suffering. Nyaya, same thing, Nyaya Sutra, other school, to transcend suffering. So ultimately, the whole point of it is, why should we want to practice yoga? Because it's the only way of stopping suffering on a deep level, not on a surface level. All the surface level ways, indulging the mind and senses, they're temporary, they're fleeting, and they don't fulfill in a deep level sort of way. So therefore yoga is, people say, well, how is that relevant to the real world? Yoga would see itself as being profoundly relevant, and the only thing that's truly permanently relevant, insofar as it takes people to a deep level state of consciousness, Svarupa, which of course Vedanta is going to say is Satchidananda, is Ananda, is blissful. That's ultimately happiness. And everything else is illusory, and if we had more time, of course, we could discuss that. So therefore, what is yoga? Yoga is Chittavritti Nirodha, it's a stilling of the mind. Tada, what happens then? What happens if you still the mind? Is that the end? Is that like existential death or something? No. Tada drashtu svarupe vastanam. Then the seer abides in its own nature. So therefore the real nature of the seer is not the mind. It's different from the mind. Now whether the mind is real or false, that's a discussion for Vedanta. So, but what does it matter? Because experientially it's the same. If you attain whether the world is real or false, and whether the Atman is an individual or one with Brahman, is a scholastic issue, because when you're in that state, it's an infinite, eternal state, and you're not aware of anything else. So what does it matter whether there is something else or there isn't, number one, and whether you're an individual and other individuals may be having the same experience, or whether there's no other individuals, it's just sarva midam kalu Brahman. What does it matter in that state? It's an infinite, eternal state. So therefore, it's really the issue becomes important for the theists. For the theists. The big debates between the Vedanta, the Vaishnavas, they don't care. Okay, Vaishnavas would say, okay, you want to, whether you want to merge into Brahman, do it. World is false, fine. Asat, does that mean it's false? But don't try to tell the Vaishnavas that Ishvara is also Maya, made of Maya. That's what they're going to fight you with. That's where the line in the sand is drawn. The rest isn't important. But if you try to say then, well, if the world is false, the creation is false, so the creator is also false, then you need to get ready, roll up your sleeves for a 2,000-year debate, which will never end. So that's the line in the sand. Is fine. Vaishnavas don't deny that you can have an infinite, eternal experience where you're not aware of anything else. So whether there is anything else or there isn't is irrelevant. Whether there's other individuals experiencing that or not is irrelevant. That's all fine. But when you then say, well, but then Ishvara is also Maya, then there's fireworks. So then you read Ramanuja's first verse of the Vedanta Sutra, 200 pages. He gets it all off his chest. Right, but 111. Ramanuja in the 12th century, he calls Shankara the Mahapurva Paksha, the great opposing point of view. Anyway, so Patanjali is not dealing with any of that. He assumes that we've spent a few lifetimes doing that, and finally are exhausted with all forms of vritti, because even intellectual vrittis at some point they're exasperating. You know, you read Shankara and it's brilliant, and you read Ramanuja and it's brilliant, and at some point you're just like, okay, and then Madhava comes along and he's a whole other thing. Madhava, another brilliant intellectual, but radical. So at some point that gets exhausting too. So then Patanjali says, okay, if you really want to have it, do you want to just think about these things, vritti away, you know? Of course you have to do that. In the second chapter, Patanjali is going to say svadhyaya, study is a fundamental part of yoga. But at some point, one either puts whatever siddhanta one's ascribing to, one at some point one has to practice. And so Patanjali then has given us the mode of practice, which is then tailored and tinkered in all different traditions. So the basic, 8-limb path of yoga, the process of dharana dhyana, in bhakti it's there. Of course, you fix the mind on japa. I mean, Patanjali talks about japa. You fix the mind on mantra. That's the most common form of meditation, and always has been and still is. So the Kundalini, traditions will tweak it with Kundalini physiology, and so everyone's going to tweak it this way and that way. But the basic practice, and early Buddhism too, was dhyana. Mindfulness is a different stream of Buddhism, and Jainism, absolutely. So if we're looking for some kind of common denominator, tying together. We have to be careful about this. We don't want to essentialize. We get in trouble with the academics. But if we're looking for some kind of a fairly common denominator amongst the deep spiritual traditions, not the cultural traditions, not the pujas, but the deep level practitioner traditions, probably the closest you're going to find is dhyana, some form of sitting and fixing the mind, and typically on a mantra. So, in fact, there's somebody I'm hoping will be doing a PhD dissertation on that, challenging the notion that there's no unity whatsoever to Hinduism, and showing that, well, actually there are, there's at least this one thing that's pretty much at the core. It's idealized. Not everyone's doing it, obviously. Maybe only 0.01%, but nonetheless, it's idealized as the sort of grand finale of most of the different traditions that go under the rubric of Hinduism. Are we going much too long? We're vrittying away here. Is it time to Nirodha? It's time to Chitta Vritti Nirodha.
We still can go on for 15 minutes more.
50 minutes. So the first 4 verses then, that's basically the whole of yoga. The rest is just embellishment on that. So 3 verses. Yoga's Chitta Vritti Nirodha, that yoga is the stilling of the mind. Tada drashtu swarupe vasthanam, then the seer, but the seer not in eyeball sense, but in consciousness. Then consciousness svarupa in its own nature, swarupe vasthanam, and this distinguishes then yoga from Buddhism. Tada drashtu swarupe vasthanam, and if it's not doing that, if consciousness is not svarupe vasthanam, it's not situated in its own nature, what's consciousness doing? Vritti sarupyam, absorbed in the mind. So the rest of everything else is just, and then unpacking that. The rest of the first chapter talks about the different stages of Chitta Vritti Nirodha, called Samadhi. And then chapter 2 is Kriya, or what do you do about, how do you do it? How do you actually get ready, prepare your mind so that it can actually be Nirodha? You have to make it sattvic. If it's rajasic and tamasic, well, you may understand what it's supposed to be, but the minute you sit down, your mind wants to check email. So, right? Tell me I'm wrong. So, and then the third chapter is this mystic power. Again, in my opinion, the commentators don't say very much about this, but I always used to think the third chapter, when I wrote the book, I thought it was, well, Patanjali's put in these mystic powers because maybe these things happen inadvertently when you're in deep states. All of a sudden you start, levitating or something. And of course you have the Gospel of Ramakrishna, if you want to read something about the expression of mystic powers in a modern meaning, modern, not living, but modern saint, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, his gospel is full of accounts of some of these cities. So I used to think, well, Patanjali has this whole and then he dismisses them. He says they're only of interest for people whose minds are outgoing, vyuttana, not to those whose minds are ingoing, trying to realize the. So why put it in there then? Why, it's like a quarter of the text. And I used to think it was just because he's warning us, well, if weird things start happening, don't be alarmed. But now I think differently. It's too late to put it in the book. But now I think it's because there were many characters in ancient India that were doing these kinds of practice, intense concentrative practices, and they were not even, and they were asuras in the great tradition. As a matter of fact, when the British went to India, the word yogi, they called it jogi, the British say it was a dirty word. Villagers were scared. You didn't want the jogi coming to your village. He might curse you. So yogis are not, read the stories in the Puranas, even the Vishishta, great Brahmins, you don't want to upset them. They'll curse you. So there's this association of yoga, which survived right into the colonial period with power and scary kind of power. So perhaps now I think that may be the case why Patanjali has this whole chapter on the cities, because he wants to make it clear that that's not what real yogis do. They're not looking for power, and they don't want to show some cheap exhibition of some trivial powers. And then the fourth chapter is mostly a response to Buddhism, because Buddhism is a polite response. It's a very gentlemanly response. The Vedanta tradition can get a little bit more polemical. But the yoga response to Buddhism is very polite. It's philosophical. It's not ad hominem. So that's the fourth chapter. So there you have it. I don't know if you've read the Yoga Sutras, but it's a fabulous text. And it would, if you're interested in a meditative practice and never quite got around to it, or you need a little bit of adds a little bit of a kick to your practice. Reading the text really does, I think, give amazing insight into the nature of mind and consciousness. And I suppose it's the go-to book for also Hindu psychology, how the mind works and samskaras. I found it profoundly affected my own practice when I studied it. So, do we have any questions? I'm sorry if I rambled on.
We're recording it, and so you conduct the thing.
Yes, okay. So, yes, sir.
Please tell us your name and ask the question.
Thank you for your nice presentation. My name is Ranjit Mitra. My question is that you beautifully explained many aspects of the Hindu philosophy, but is it a practice? Is it a philosophy? Is it a knowledge or intellect? Or it is just control of mind and action? But what does the other dimension call in that in Indian traditions, this mysticism or the grace of God comes in? Where do we get it in the Patanjali Sutras? Or is it something
sure.
not there?
There's not, the Yoga Sutras already presupposes knowledge. It's not a knowledge text. It's not a jnana text. It presupposes knowledge of Sankhya. As a matter of fact, it comes out of Sankhya. There was no difference between Sankhya and Yoga before the sutras. When Vyasa writes his commentary, he says this is a commentary on Sankhya. So it presupposes you already have knowledge. So it's a practice text. It's dedicated to teaching us how to practice. So he tells us, okay, right in the beginning, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, this is what you do. Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Then he discusses the different states, but not in the sense of knowledge, more as signposts to practice. So the knowledge texts are the Vedanta Sutras and Sankhya and the knowledge traditions and Nyaya and Vaisheshika Those are knowledge traditions. By the time you get to yoga, yoga's coming out of the knowledge traditions. It's coming out of Sankhya. It was also coming out of the Upanishads. But the Patanjali's, the goal of it is not to present a metaphysics. The goal is to present a practice, how to practice. In terms of, Ishvara is there in the Yoga Sutras, but very understated. So if you're going to fix the mind, you have to fix it on something. The alambana. Right? If you're going to nirodha the mind, to fix something, you have to fix it on something. And the mind is no different. It has to be fixed on something. And so Patanjali gives a list of things to fix it on, but he starts off with Ishvara, and he has like 5 or 6 verses on Ishvara, so he's clearly presenting that as the best option. And how do you fix the mind on Ishvara? Well, tasya vachaka pranavaha. Ishvara comes as pranavas, Om. Well, what do you do with that? Well, tajapa. Tajapa, do japa of the Om. So the Ishvara is there in the form of japa, and then later on in chapter, you asked about grace, later on in chapter 2, Patanjali says, samadhi siddhir Ishvara pranidanat. Ishvara can give you samadhi. Same as Krishna says in the Gita several times. He says, okay, it's very easy, it's easy. I will give you, I will give you, I will give you. So there is an Ishvara element there, but it's very understated. So if you're looking for a Patanjalian practice which is with a richer Ishvara devotional element, then we have to go to the Puranas.
The point is that as Swami Vivekananda has explained, those 4 yogas, the karma yoga, the bhakti yoga, the dhyana yoga, the raja yoga. So I think Patanjali is more like what you call dhyana yoga or raja yoga than exactly like karma yoga. He's not advising you to be active in the...
No, he's advising to do inaction.
Yes.
In the Gita, Krishna talks about 2 paths.
Yes. So is there like a conflict, or it's just
not a
like
conflict, it's just a different way. Krishna says there are 2 paths, and one got lost, the path of action, in chapter 4. And Krishna says, and I'm coming back to establish the action path. And Bhaktosi, you're my bhakta, so I'm teaching it to you. But the other path is the inaction path, which is a Patanjalian type of path, where you're not, if it's true that you're the Atman, and it's true that you're not the body-mind, then why waste time flapping about in the world? You go to the forest. Why the forest? Because you want to go to a place where you won't be distracted. Right? In Christianity, it's the desert. You go to the desert. But in Hinduism, you go to the forest. And nirodha the world. Pratyahara, what is the 5th limb of yoga? Pratyahara, close out the world.
But in Indian, most of the Indian philosophy, religious studies, they don't deny the world. They said there are different ashramas in a person's life, like garhastha, like brahmacharya, garhastha, vanaprastha, then sannyas. So I do not know if it is. It's just an idea. Or
it's
just
a different option.
Yes.
It's a different option. Krishna is saying about how to do yoga with the Varna ashram and do your duty. That's the teachings of Bhagavad Gita. Patanjali is giving a different set of options. They're both valid. You don't have to have either or.
All right, so one question.
Not from my Rutgers students. You know, you guys get no. You had 5 years of questions.
No, we should have them. Give them a chance.
You still got questions?
They ask
I failed in my dharma.
good questions.
Professor.
Do you know
Swamiji.
these gentlemen?
He is come here.
As practitioners or striving practitioners, dietetics is something that always comes up. You know,
What is?
diet, like what we eat.
Diet. Oh.
Right. So like vegetarian, non-vegetarian, veganism is quite popular these days. What would the Yoga Sutras speak about this? And actually, Swamiji, you have also mentioned that sometimes that because strictness in dietetics also could become a hindrance, and also you brought up a good point earlier that sometimes that can someone not be self-realized if they eat animals, right? Like Swami Vivekananda had fish, right? So
Well, I'm not going to respond to that last part, but clearly the Ahimsa tradition is vegetarian. And if you're asking about Patanjalian yoga tradition, it's clearly vegetarian. So that's just a given. So in other words, why would you, apart from the dietary aspect of it, if you're really able to see the Atman in all beings, and you're able to see the suffering in all beings, and the Jains are particularly powerful here, and they're saying, can't you see the animals suffer? Can't you see that just like you flee when your life is threatened, they flee when their life is threatened? It's very powerful. So the reason for ahimsa is compassion. In our modern day, the reason for a vegetarian diet tends to be selfish, right? The environment, health, the economy, right? Or if we don't eat, if we don't feed cows, all that grain we could solve world hunger. So they tend to be, in a sense, selfish, whereas the arguments in ancient India were compassion-based. Why would you call it, if you're an enlightened being and you see the Atman, as Krishna says in the Gita, right, Vidya Vinaya Sampane Brahmane Gavi Hastini, you see the Atman in all beings. Why on earth would you contribute to an activity that causes suffering? So it's a given that it's certainly in the yoga tradition that ahimsa means vegetarianism. Now, you'll find ways of wriggling out of that, fine. You'll find stories in the Puranas of, Vishishta ate meat, and, you'll find, if you're looking, if that's samskaras and your desires and your raga, I really need that, you'll find some pramana, you'll find some textual authority that will say, oh, well, he did it, so if that's what you're looking for, you'll find it. But let's be clear that the ahimsa tradition is a vegetarian tradition, and not just in Hinduism, but in Jainism, and in early Buddhism, I would say, although that's another story. So then can one be a yogi? And the other thing about meat, apart from the compassion aspect, from a selfish point of view, it creates tamas in the mind. It's dead, it's rotting. If you read the Bhagavad Gita, it talks about sattvic food. That's a good place to look. So there, anything that's rotting is tamas, anything that's dead and rotting. So therefore, when you eat meat is dead. I mean, you buy it, and they pump it full of preservatives and color to make it not look dead, but it's disgusting. So if you eat it, it's rotting flesh. Or are you supposed to call it something else? It's rotting flesh. So if you eat that, apart from, let's say you don't give a damn about the animal, compassion, throw that out the window. But meat has a tamasicizing effect. It will create tamas in the mind. So even from the selfish point of view, I want to be a practitioner. From a Patanjalian point of view, I want to nirodha my mind. To nirodha the mind has to be completely sattvic, 100% sattvic. And so therefore, anything that's tamasic is an obstacle, is an obstacle to that goal. So for that reason as well, meat, both from the point of view of compassion, and that's the higher reason, but from a sort of also from the point of view of attaining the goal of chitta vritti nirodha, vaisharada, you have to be full clarity. You can't have meat in your system, because that will produce tamas.
Thank you.
Tell me how you really feel, right?
Hi, my name is Namit Gupta. I had a question about how Yoga Sutras of Patanjali relate to Christian mysticism. There is a concept of dark night of the soul in Christian mysticism. I was wondering, do the Patanjali Sutras talk about ego death, and what would be your take? Is that an unavoidable situation when someone is going into samadhi or not?
I mean, it's been a very long time since I read Dark Night of the Soul, but as I remember it, the idea there is that you go in the beginning of your practice, you get results, and you're all enthusiastic, but then you go through this period where it seems like you're stagnating, especially also in the bhakti traditions, and you feel like your initial enthusiasm and experiences all of a sudden start to get less, and it feels like you're making no progress at all. And so then you go through this dark night of the soul where you have doubts, and then you have to go right back to the beginning and think, okay, why am I doing this? And why did I start this whole thing? So that's my understanding of what the dark night of the soul is. And then you have to go through that period of where it seems like God has distanced himself or herself, and you're struggling and getting nowhere, but you have to go through that period, and then eventually success comes. But in terms of ego death, of course, The ego is Ashmita in Patanjali, and that is one of the kleshas, the obstacles. So you have to go past any form of ego, which is, yeah.
Is that something unavoidable, or is everyone has to go through that process?
Everyone has to go through the ego. The ego is what is, consciousness is external. Ego means I'm this body and mind, right? So if we think with this body-mind, then consciousness is absorbed in the body-mind. And if it's thinking I'm this body, I'm male, I'm white, and I'm my mind, I'm happy, I'm sad. That means consciousness is externalized and pervading the coverings around it. So if it's externalized, it's not swarupe vastanam, it's not absorbed in its own nature. So therefore, any type of Patanjalian practice, and you can look for parallels in Christianity, if you looked in the Gnostic traditions, yes, you have to go past ego. Ego is a false covering. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, because the Atman is the same in all beings. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
Professor, you are so learned. I am very humbled to ask you a question. First of all, I am a devotee of Sri Ramakrishna Thakur, and as much as I learned from him, that he didn't teach me to lean towards mysticism. He told me that I learned that you float like a lotus and you will never drown. Then Patanjali helps is a valid point to control external mind to internalize, to realize reality. That reality to discover myself. That Thakur taught me. And in that case, it's not that blindly I accept that Thakur is Bhagavan. Thakur told the truth. How to know yourself. What is reality? And number two question for...
No, what was the question? It's not clear.
No, question is that
In the microphone.
to me, I learned from Thakur that Thakur taught me to go above mysticism. Don't use Patanjali as to acquire power, to abuse power, to gain power, being a asur. That I learned from him.
Okay.
Number two,
No, but what is the question?
question is that
That's a
it's
statement.
true that Thakur teach me that or
okay.
not.
What's the second question?
Second question in term of food, that if I admit my existence, that I exist, in that case, food is secondary because I cannot eat anything. If I'm too compassionate, trees, when you cut the trees, it seems that tree has life. I should not eat anything in this world, then how can I admit I exist?
Sure. The Jains would say, you minimize as much as possible violence. So the Jains would not even eat any root vegetables. And then Vaishnavas would say that, okay, there's always violence. There's always violence, even if you cut. Of course, when you take an apple, you're not killing the tree, and you're taking the apple at the time when if you didn't take it, it would fall anyway. So a lot of vegetables, there's no violence, but there's some, like the wheat, that you're cutting. So Vaishnavas would say, then you offer to Ishvara with devotion. And then any little residue of karma that is even in the vegetarian diet, by the offering with bhakti, then that gets removed. And it goes back to the old mimamsa, the old manu, the mimamsas where you have to, the householders, they have the four kinds of, anyway, it doesn't matter. But that's one thing we can do, is we offer as prasad.
And also if I leave a place, there is no tree too much, only river, I have to eat fish because I don't have choice.
Well, not according to Patanjali wouldn't accept that.
No?
He would say, Jati, Desha, Kala, Samaya, Anavichinnaha. There's no exceptions based on your jati, your family, Desha, your country, geography, where you're living, Kala, the time, and Samaya, condition. Anavichinnaha, Mahavratam, it's the great vow. So Patanjali would not accept that you should eat fish. If there's water and fish, then there's water, there's vegetation. If there's vegetation, then plants are growing. If plants are growing, we'll stick some seeds in and eat vegetables.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Don't you still owe me a paper? You owe me a paper, young man.
No, I don't.
Not you?
So my question was that.
What's your name? Yeah.
Oh, my name is Neil. My question was: is in in the practice of meditation, is there a difference between mindfulness and the meditation of the Yoga Sutras?
Yes.
And then just one more question: the witness that is talked about in Buddhist meditation, is there a difference between the witness consciousness and then the seer?
For Patanjali, there would be.
Yeah.
So in Buddhism, there were two. Early Buddhism was dhyana, chitta vritti nirodha practices, and there are differences of opinion among scholars as to how far back mindfulness goes. Because I've read some scholars say it goes way back, early days, and others saying it's more recent. But it doesn't matter. Mindfulness, you don't nirodha the mind. You're not stilling the mind. You're allowing it to do whatever it wants, and you're just witnessing it. And by witnessing it, you see how foolish and fickle and silly it is. And that in itself, just the power of observation, makes the foolishness evaporate a little bit. Right. Right. So mindfulness there's no attempt to still the mind. Now, in terms of the witnessing consciousness, you'd have to, because of course Buddhism doesn't accept that there's an Atman underpinning everything, although they do accept consciousness. It's just
right.
that they say consciousness is momentary and interdependent. But anyway, that witness would be the buddhi in Sankhya, not the Atman. The Atman is not doing anything, it's just conscious. So to witness, that actual witness of the mind is the buddhi, it's the higher mind. And so you have in the Upanishads, that the charioteer is the buddhi and the mind is the reins. But the Atman is just a passenger, it's not doing anything. So it's providing consciousness, but there's no cerebral activity or processing. All of that's buddhi. So the higher awareness is buddhi. And of course, any chitta vritti nirodha is buddhi. Because who's nirodhaing the mind? It's not the Atman. Who's nirodhaing the mind? It's buddhi. If you want to use Patanjali calls it the Nirodha Samskara, but what's the Nirodha Samskara? It's buddhi. So different traditions may use different phraseology, but that's going on that's the higher mind. So any type of yoga practice, it's not going on in the Atman, it's going on in the mind. The mind is eliminating itself, actually, in yoga. The mind is realizing that it is the cause of suffering, that it is an imposter. And through jnana, it can know that. Through jnana, it realizes its own external nature. So then it decides, and it is the cause of suffering with its desires and illusions. So essentially, the mind is nirodhaing itself. It sounds bizarre, but that's what's happening.
Right. So when we say the seer is abiding in its own nature, that's what we're saying?
Yeah. When the seer abides in it's not aware of the mind. The minute you're witnessing your mind, you're externalized. Consciousness is external. In Svarupa Vastanam, there's no awareness of the mind. It's Svarupa, Sva, its own Rupa Avasthanam, situated in itself. There's no awareness of the mind. You're not being mindful. That's earlier stages.
Right.
But of course, we can't skip those stages. But ultimately, that state of pure consciousness is content-less. There's no content. So that's nirguna. It's nirguna, sarvavyapaka, it's infinite, it's all-pervading, potentially. And Vedanta will say it's ananda. Otherwise, who was going to do it? If you don't throw in ananda, if you just say sat chit, well, it is, and it's conscious, I don't, who's going to sign off on that? Go to the forest for 50 years just for sat and chit? I'll be sat and chit right here, thank you very much. So you have to throw in some ananda there, otherwise who would seek it? So, yeah.
So are consciousness and Atman the same thing?
Yes. In other words, if we try to find the seer, the best translation for drashtra, because that's the term that's used, drashtra and drishya, is but pure consciousness. And it gets confusing because often consciousness is used in Western philosophy to mean consciousness of something. So it helps if you add pure consciousness. And by pure, we mean not mixed with anything else, not mixed with an object. If there's an object and consciousness becomes conscious of the object, it's now mixing with the object, so now it's aware of it. So if you use the word pure, it means it's not like pure milk. It's not mixed with anything. It's just pure milk. So better to say pure consciousness, to be very clear about how there's no word in Western language, because there's no history of that notion. and maybe in some mystical traditions, but even then, there's no clear history of that, you know, so there's no real vocabulary. So then we have to create terms like pure consciousness.
Right. So then in that case...
And which is, by the way, which is Nirbija Samadhi, Asampragnata Samadhi, Kaivalya, within the sutras as Svarupe Vastanam. These 4 phrases are all synonymous in the Yoga Sutras.
So in that case, consciousness is not a byproduct of the brain.
No, it's not an epiphenomenon of the brain. In other words, it is not a neuron. Yoga would say you will never find the neurological correlate of consciousness. And right now, the neurological model of consciousness is dominant in you study neurology?
No.
No. But the neurological model of consciousness is dominant, and that's the holy grail. You have to find the neuron, or the combination of neuron, or the material brain conditions, which you can demonstrate, repeat, that this is the origin of consciousness. Yoga will say, keep going.
So
We'll check back in 50 years.
Sure.
If I could just say, okay, go on, Swamiji, and I make one other point.
No, this is a very good way of segueing into what I wanted to ask. Right now, the hard problem of consciousness is a big thing in not only the philosophy of mind, but in AI, in neuroscience.
Sure.
David Chalmers is right here in NYU who's proposed it. As you just, in fact, you initiated the discussion right now very beautifully, saying that the dominant dogma is that somehow consciousness must be an epiphenomenon,
Yeah.
a product of the
Sure.
biochemical processes in the brain.
Yeah.
And what David Chalmers and others have said is that the purely subjective nature of experience, qualia, that can, in principle, it cannot be explained by something objective like the brain, no matter
Sure.
how complex you make it.
Yeah.
At this point, the question is, the Sankhya, Yoga, and Advaita, and maybe in some sense, the Yogacara, Madhyamaka
Yeah.
idea of Swaprakasha Chaitanya,
Yeah.
consciousness which is self-effulgent. Do you think it can? What would your reaction be to the whole problem at this stage? And what can Sankhya, Yoga, and Advaita contribute to the discussion on the hard problem of consciousness?
What the Indian, the Sankhya and Vedanta traditions can contribute is the proposal that, which is called substance dualism in Western philosophy. Substance dualism, which is often associated with Descartes, but later forms, that consciousness is not in any way material.
Yes.
And that therefore, of course, philosophers of religion can debate this, but philosophers of religion know that that there's problems with both arguments, but there are problems. I'm reading an article right now by a materialist philosopher of religion who's saying, I'm a materialist, I don't accept that it's a separate substance, but I need to acknowledge in honesty that there's no good arguments being brought forth to disprove that view. So that's the philosophers of religion. Now, in terms of science, I think Nyaya has something to say here, because Nyaya says, okay, identify it then. If it's a material thing, Nyaya uses inference. If it's a material thing, well, where is it? Produce it. And of course, they didn't talk about neurons. They talked about what their understanding of the self. They say, where is consciousness? Is it in the leg? Is it in the arm? And then by process of elimination, when you realize that it cannot be found in any material substance, then you make an inference that it must be something other. So I think science can get to that point. They can't start talking about Atman and Krishna with his flute and a peacock feather. That's not science. But they can get to the point, maybe 10 years, 15, 20 years, when they fail to find the neurological correlate of consciousness, that then they'll be forced to concede it must be something other. That's as far as you can go with science. It must be something other. At that point, then the mystical traditions of India step in with their. We've been saying this all along for 2,000 years, and here's what we have to say. But science has to run its course first.
David Chalmers.
It's got to fail to find those neurological correlates. And if it finds them, we're in trouble, my friends.
We're in trouble. That's what I say. We are open to the truth. Show us and we'll be convinced.
Yes.
And I'm going to say goodbye to all religion and spirituality.
Yes.
Except maybe a pragmatic use might remain over. But I can't see on principle how the purely subjective, the qualia nature, the first person.
And that's what philosophers of religion will say.
Right.
It's a quality that, even by philosophy, right, qualities have to be grounded in substances. There's no substances that can account for the quality, the qualia, the quality of consciousness. So we just need to let that run its course, and we'll keep chanting our mantras.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, this is our contribution.
Absolutely.
At the end of the
Yes,
day, then people then, having gone through that, will then maybe look at the spiritual traditions with fresh eyes. But right now, there's a materialistic dogma. It's like a faith, actually. It's a faith.
It's a faith.
It's not based on any evidence. So there's an actual faith, which some people call the new, scientism.
Scientism.
Yeah.
Right. One more point related
Yes.
to this. The distinction between consciousness and mind, when you apply the drashta and drishya
Yeah.
paradigm, in Sankhya, in yoga, and in Advaita,
Yeah.
in fact, in just about every Indian philosophy, they make a very clear distinction between Atman and Manas.
Yeah.
This is not clear in modern consciousness studies.
Uh-huh.
They keep swinging back and forth
Sure.
between consciousness and
Yeah.
mind. There's
And that's another contribution, because
Another contribution.
when people want to critique Descartes,
yes,
they say he cannot account for how, because he says mind is spiritual.
yeah,
So they say he cannot account for how a spiritual thing can influence a material thing. But Sankhya and Yoga and everybody except Nyaya, and Nyaya would say it's a quality of the Atman, Jnana.
Yes.
But the Vedanta Sankhya Yoga would say mind is material.
Yeah.
So that avoids that particular problem Descartes has, that is associated with substance dualism, which tends to get connected to Descartes, because Sankhya says, no, mind is material and matter can affect matter.
right.
So therefore that eliminates that particular problem. I'm not saying there's not other problems.
Leading to a consciousness-matter duality.
Yes. So therefore consciousness is not doing anything. It's not affecting anything. It's just animating everything.
Right.
It's a different proposal.
Sankhya Yoga stop at a substance dualism.
Yes.
But Advaita,
Yes.
I think the closest term I found to it in modern philosophy is a neutral monism, that you have one substance, you don't have to call it spiritual or material, because it underlies both the so-called spiritual and material.
Well, wouldn't you just call it idealism?
That's what they would try to call it, but
Yeah.
idealism, the way idealism is understood, the general trend in idealism is that everything is reduced to the mind.
Yeah.
But when you make a distinction
There's
between
not even
mind and consciousness...
There's no correlate. Why do you look for correlate? Why do we look for correlates? Why can't we just establish? Why do we have to frame Eastern tradition in Western categories? They don't do that.
No, they don't do
They're
that.
not framing their Western categories in Indian terms.
Right.
So let's hold our turf and say you need, if you want to talk to us, you need to learn a few Sanskrit terms, my friends.
No,
Because there is no correlate.
right. I agree entirely. But
Yeah.
because the term substance dualism is brought up, I thought maybe an easier way to for them to
Fair
ease
enough.
into this idea
I
would
don't
be a
know
neutral
that term.
monism.
I don't know what that neutral monism.
I just found it recently. I mean, it's
I mean, the problem with that is nobody knows what that is. I mean, it's not even Western philosophers. So you know what I mean. You're better off with the Sanskrit.
right. All right, that's very important, encouraging.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hello. He's in line.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Rodrigo, and I was just recently reading that Vedavyasa is a title that is not an actual person, that have been many Vedavyasas. Would you mind to elaborate on that?
I don't have anything to say. It's possible. Certainly, I mean, the tradition says he was a person,
Yeah.
and that he's an anksha. In the Bhagavata Purana says Vedavyasa is an anksha of Narayana. He's a real person. So tradition has said that. But it's true. Like, for example, if you sit to give a talk in some ashrams, it's called the Vyasa-san, the asana of Vyas. So it also, it's true, has the status of a title. So you could take it that way if you wanted, Vedavyas.
No, it's okay.
But that doesn't mean that the tradition is not saying he wasn't a historical person.
No, I didn't mean that.
No.
So if I don't recall bad, I think that where I was reading it, it said that the current Vedavyasa was somebody that went by the name of Krishna and
Dvaipayana.
Dvaipayana.
Dvaipayana. But that is Vedavyas.
That's Vedavyasa.
Look, Vedavyas is a function. Veda is the Veda. Vyasa means to separate.
Okay.
So Vyasa means to divide, the divider. So the one who divided the Veda, the one who Vyasad the Veda is Veda Vyas. So that was his function. But his name is Krishna Dvaipayana. The tradition, I mean, if you accept any historical value at all to the tradition, he was a person. Now, maybe later on the term gets used as a title. I don't know.
Okay.
I haven't seen it used. I mean, if it is, it's not used ubiquitously as a title.
No.
But it could be used. I wouldn't deny that.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sanjay Dey. So my question is on the historicity of
Is
the
everybody
traditions.
Bengali here? Are we all Bengali, Indian gentlemen Bengali? No. Okay. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah. So my question is the historicity of the traditions. So
Yes.
when you mentioned that during the 18th century, the colonial British period, and also the Dayanand Saraswati didn't find an authentic yoga teacher of the traditions.
Yes.
I recently came across to this Nath tradition, which is very common in the eastern part of Bengal, Assam, Nepal, and they claim that they are neither Advaitic nor theistic, and they are the true perceptors and preservers of the yoga tradition, which is very popular and later got influenced the Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism as well. So the Matsyendranath and Gorakshanath. So what's your point on that?
Well,
Because
it's a
this is
lot
a
of-
very living tradition till today.
Sure. There's a lot of great work coming out of SOAS in London. There's a scholar there whose name is Jim. I forget his
Jim
name. Mallison. James Mallison, and he's got a very nice grant, and that he's accessing all of the Tantra, the Nath, the Hatha texts. Although I don't know how far back they go. I would, at this point, resist the idea that yoga comes out of the Natha tradition. Certainly it's absorbed into the Natha tradition. But yeah, the Nathas are not Advaitin. They are Advaitin, but in a different sort of way. There's different types of Advaita. They're Advaita in the sense that the Atman becomes one with the Supreme, but the world is real for them. It's not Maya. It's not a superimposition. It's Chitti Shakti. It's pulsating spanda. It's Shakti. So therefore, they're monists of a different type. So they're theologians like Abhinavagupta reject Advaita Vedanta, or at least they counter Advaita Vedanta. So the Natha, whether you want to call it Tantrika or Hatha, these cluster of traditions, very strong in, as you say, in Bengal and Assam, and the Himalayas and affects Tibetan Buddhism. Those traditions, the world is real. So in that sense, it's different from Advaita Vedanta.
Yes, but it's a part of the yoga tradition, right?
Well, it's an expression of the yoga tradition. I mean, yoga is Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So that can get absorbed into so many different ways. In Vaishnavism, where Bhagavan is real, not, there's Vaikuntha, there's Saguna Brahman, there's condensed consciousness that has Nama and Rupa. They also use a Chitta Vritti Nirodha practice. So the Chitta Vritti Nirodha is a practice. It can be used in Jainism, it can be used in Buddhism, it can be used in Nat, it can be used in Vaishnavism, it can be used in Advaita Vedanta. Although most Advaita Vedanta is more focused on jnana rather than any action that can bring it about, because action is ultimately unreal. So the Advaita Vedanta, but there's no reason why you couldn't use Chitta Vritti Nirodha practice in hardcore Advaita. So it's a practice. You could use it in Christianity.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. Was the Mataji up? Are you? Yes. Swagatam.
I have a very short question.
Please tell us your name.
My name is Shipra Roy. So,
Namaskar.
how would the string theory goes to explain consciousness?
Oh, ask these gentlemen behind you. Ask Raghava. I'm afraid I'm not an expert. I'm trying to read more about it. Next semester, I'm teaching a course called Science and Religion.
Yes, science and religion.
Yeah. But I don't know enough right now. Okay. But my friend Raghava behind you, get him afterwards.
Thank you.
And buy him a chai, and then he'll tell you everything about string theory. But anyway, there is somebody called Amit Goswami, who I believe has written a couple of books. So he'd be in a much better position. I think his books will probably deal with that. Amit Goswami.
My name is Babu Bangaru. I have two questions. One is, you alluded to this earlier. What is the essential difference in the metaphysics of Buddhism and Hinduism? What's the difference between nirvana and the tradition of moksha as it is talked about by Patanjali?
Patanjali specifically, because when we say Hinduism, remember there's many different understanding of what moksha is.
Okay.
So moksha is different, in Advaita Vedanta, at least in terms of how the scholastics present it. And there's many schools of Buddhism. It's the same thing. You have, already centuries and centuries and centuries ago, we had 18 different schools of Buddhism. But one difference is that from the point of view of, look at verse number 3 of Patanjali, what happens when you chitta vritti nirodha, tada, then what happens? Drashtu svarupe vastanam. The Sikh consciousness abides in its own nature, autonomous, independent, self-contained. It's essential. It has its essence. And it can remain in its own essence, separated from everything else, and that essence never changes. Sat. It's always in a continuous state. Buddhism, as of the philosophers, doesn't accept, that consciousness can be svarupe situated in its own nature. Consciousness is always interdependent with objects. So perhaps the most important word in Mahayana, Nagarjuna, Madhyamika Buddhism is interdependence, praticca samutpada. So therefore consciousness can never be svarupe vastanam. It always is interdependent, number one. Number two, it's not sat. It's not continuous, eternally, it's not being in a never-changing way. It is momentary, kshanika. It lasts a kshana, and then followed by another moment, another moment, another moment. So therefore, that's the metaphysical difference. Now in terms of nirvana, Buddhists don't talk about some state beyond, like, Brahman or Vaikuntha. At least for Nagarjuna, he would say samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara. It's just an enlightened way of being in the world, of being part of the flow of your particular, you call it a flow of your particular persona. That momentary interdependent flow remains in reality, doesn't go anywhere, but in an enlightened sort of way. It's very hard to get a good response to what is nirvana from Buddhism, because it's just a tricky thing. But those, at least metaphysically, those are two differences. The consciousness is momentary. For all the Indian schools, it's eternal, not momentary. Number one, and number two, the other schools, Jainism included, it can be absorbed in its own true nature, which is in the essence. For Buddhism, there is no essence, because if everything's momentary, where's the essence? Essence is something that remains. So there is no essence. It's momentary and interdependent. It doesn't exist on its own. It's always existing like Indra's net. If you think of a fishing net, if you think of the knot of a net, the knot doesn't exist by itself. It's actually a mixture of this string and this string and this string and this string. It's interdependent. It doesn't have an essential nature of its own. It's interdependent on four things feeding into it. It's a good analogy, Indra's net. So that would be a difference.
But what would
for the scholars, for the scholastics.
But what would then be nirvana?
That's an enlightened way of being in this interdependent momentary flow of things. You're not clinging onto the idea of an individual. The very thing that Patanjali is proposing, that you seek this autonomous individual, Buddhists would say that very thing that the yogis seek is the cause of samsara. So it's night and day. The very thing that the yogis claim as the goal of life, the Buddhists would say that clinging onto the idea that there's an autonomous, separate individual, that's the cause of samsara. So that's why Patanjali has to spend a section of chapter 4 responding to that.
See, the crux of the problem, as we discussed today and as all along, is the consciousness.
Is consciousness. I mean, and
consciousness in the Hindu or spiritual
Yeah, and of
Eastern
course,
way.
and of course, some Hindu traditions would say there's also Ishvara, but they have to debate that also with Jains and Mimamsas. But yes, but it's consciousness.
See, as a student of biology, or as we all know it, it's easy to understand evolution of life and therefore the illusion of life force by natural selection. Where does the consciousness fit in? How does it come
that's
about?
a problem that modern Hindus have to figure that out.
Okay.
This is one of the challenges of modernity, because there's no Darwinism in the Puranas or the epics. So this is a challenge, as it has been for Christian theologians, because for Christian theologians, the same thing, that God made the forms. How did the forms come to be? Before Darwin, one of the arguments for God was, how do you explain the existence of forms?
Sure.
So Darwin knocked that one off, its legs. Well, the Puranas say Brahma created the forms. Brahma with long A. And it's a problem, because karma, it's not that you start off with a single-cell organism and end up as a human. The karma theory requires you start as a human, because the human makes karma. Ants and bugs and single-celled molecules don't make karma. So a karma model, Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain, traditionally, pre-Darwin, proposed that there has to be at some point a human birth. Now, how do you get around it? Well, there's all kinds of ways. You could talk about other universes, but you have to work at it. You have to get on your thinking hat and think, how are you going to sponsor it, and just like Christian theologians had to do.
So it essentially remains a subjective experience rather than there's no objective evidence of the postulate of all-pervading, expanding consciousness, right?
I mean, at the end of the day, now we're changing, so not bracketing Darwin. At the end of the day, pramana, right? How do we know something? Okay, so we know it. Vedanta is going to say, okay, we know it because the Upanishads talk about it. But even Shankara will say that ultimately it has to be experience. Until you experience it, you don't know it. And that's where Patanjali makes his magnificent contribution.
That's what I'm sorry.
Patanjali makes his unique contribution, because the Vedanta is about knowledge, it's about jnana, it's about systematizing the Upanishads, about saying, well, really it's all about Brahman, and this is, the prana is really Brahman, and the akasha, so it's really knowledge. The other sutra tradition, it's Patanjali says, Attak, done all that, that's not gonna, you won't know it that way. Yoganushasanam, chittavritti nirodha. So it's about experience, and it makes it experiential, which makes it, in a sense, scientific. Not scientific in a modern sense, but it makes it something that based on experience, that much at all. So that's why it's powerful. I think that's why it's very appealing also in the West.
The very word experience presupposes experiencer.
Yes. So experience. So therefore, the darshana, the drishi shakti, to use Patanjali's language, there's a drashtra, there's the seer. So that power of seeing can either see, Buddhists would say, well, Nagarjuna would say, if you have a seer who's seeing, well, you have to have a scene. You can't take out the scene. It's meaningless to say the seer is seeing. Well, seeing what? There must be a scene. So that's why Madhyamika is going to say, it's interdependent with his object. Yogas are going to say, well, that may make logical sense if you frame it that way, but the seer can see. But that seeing doesn't have to have an external object. It can svarupa. It can be seeing its own nature. So that's experiential, yes. So at the end of the day, the yogis can say, if you want proof of this, if you want pramana, then do it. And that's kind of, there's not much you can say to that, is there? How are you going to answer that one?
Thank you very much, Professor Bryant. That was a wonderful talk and a very exciting Q&A session. I'm particularly glad because this is actually the culminating talk in a series we started earlier this year, the Swami Abhedananda Lectures in Philosophy and Religion. We have had Professor John Thatamanil from Union Seminary, the Union Theological Seminary, coming and speaking here, Professor Janardhan Ganeri, Professor Jack Stratton-Hawley, Swami Chetananandji gave a talk in the series, and now we have Professor Bryant. My first introduction to him was through this book. He's too modest to mention it, and he speaks sort of self-deprecatingly about it, but this is a fantastic work. I thoroughly recommend it. You see, what he has mentioned is the Yoga Sutras have commentaries. I remember when we were novices in Belur Mutt, when we read the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, we read it with Vyasa Bhashya, which he has mentioned. But there are other commentaries also. There is the commentary of Vijnana Bhikshu. There is the Bhoja Vritti, which he also mentioned. Now, the problem with these commentaries is they are a little abstruse and they're distant from us by 1,000 years or more than that. And when you translate them, even if you translate them into English, it still remains very difficult to use for a practitioner. What he has done is, the beauty of this book is that he has used all those commentaries, and then in very lucid presentation, he has taken the important points which are very useful for clarifying concepts and putting into practice. So you have the benefit of the original Yoga Sutras, a simple explanation of the Yoga Sutras, and a commentarial tradition going back, I don't know, more than 2,000 years. The benefit of all of that in a concentrated form. So I cannot, I cannot praise it too highly, because this is really, really wonderful. This is possibly the best book, not possibly, I'll drop the possibly. It is the best book, the best textbook on the Patanjali Yoga Sutras in the market. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and you just search with his name. Nowadays it's very easy, Amazon Prime, right here. One day, you have to wait 2 days at the most. So very soon we'll have drones coming with this book and dropping it off at your doorstep. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Edwin F. Bryant. Another reason why I'm very happy about today's talk and having Professor Bryant here speaking about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is Swami Vivekananda, who founded the Vedanta Society of New York, and after all, this is the first one of all the Vedanta societies. It's older than Belur Mutt itself. His first work, and maybe the best known work, is his own commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is called Raja Yoga. So this book was published from the Vedanta Society of New York. In fact, he had more or less completed all his writing by 1895. It was the first book. I remember someone like J.D. Salinger writing about it. 50 years later, he's writing that these two are classics, these two little classics, Raja Yoga and Karma Yoga. I think our American youth should carry them around in their pockets. J.D. Salinger is writing that. So Swamiji's work is a work of spiritual genius. It's a standalone work. This is a textbook which you can use to learn the entire tradition. The other thing I wanted to say was Professor Bryant is not just a professor. He's a sadhaka. He's a spiritual practitioner. So I'm saying things which he will never say himself in public, but he's a spiritual practitioner. I know why that's important for this audience especially to know that. And he is not a dry jnani. He's not an introverted yogi. Actually, it might surprise you to know, he's actually a bhakta. If you look at the list of his books, half of his books are about Krishna. Literally, if you count, half the books are about Krishna. That's Professor Bryant. There's a beautiful discussion here and so many questions which keep coming up in our classes here. Even the question about string theory, at first it seems off-center, but actually, one of the most brilliant researchers right now, Ed Witten, in Princeton, in Institute of Advanced Studies, I found a little clip on YouTube where Ed Witten is asked about consciousness, and he says that I think consciousness will always remain a mystery from a scientific point of view. He says it will always remain a mystery. We will certainly learn more and more about the workings of the brain in the years ahead, but why these workings should be associated with something like consciousness, I don't think physics can explain. He says that, actually. And the interviewer, you'll see it's funny, interviewer doesn't get it at all. The next question is, so you want it to remain a mystery? He says, no, what I say is that for physics it will remain a mystery. And then he goes on to ask, so do you think beauty produces consciousness? He's completely off track, the interviewer. Ed Witten gets the whole question about the first person experience, the subjective nature of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, and so on. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Professor Bryant for making time. You don't know how busy he is. We were trying to schedule this talk much earlier, but it's easy to understand because all the yoga studios, they want somebody like Professor Bryant to come in and talk about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So the talk in Bahamas, in the Shivananda Yoga Ashram, right? So in many places, and it's very difficult to get a date from him, but we managed it, and he's here with us today, and we are very, very thankful to him, though he did get wet in the process, coming from Penn Station. I thought he would take the subway from Penn Station to here, but he walked all the way from Penn Station. I'm an Englishman. You're an Englishman, yes. It's home weather. Yes. Thank you very much, and do join us for Prashad downstairs. Thank you.